This week on Perspective, nuclear tension on the rise, the risks and the fears. There have been few times in modern history when the threat of a nuclear attack has seemed so real. An ever louder and faster drumbeat of North Korea's military menace. In the 6 years since Kim Jong-un took power, he has launched more nuclear and missile tests than his father and grandfather in the previous quarter century. With a totalitarian leader intent on his own survival, the North Korean regime is boasting that the continental U.S. is within range. And there's growing concern that it will soon have the capability to attach a nuclear warhead to an intercontinental ballistic missile aimed at the U.S. This week, the North Korean deputy UN ambassador warned that the U.S. had pushed the Korean peninsula to the brink of war.
It has been created a dangerous situation in which the thermonuclear war may break out at any moment.
If in the past the U.S. policy toward North Korea was described as strategic patience, it seems that no longer holds.
And we can't have madmen out there shooting rockets all over the place. And by the way, Rocket Man should have been handled a long time ago.
At the United Nations, Trump mocked Kim and went even further.
We will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime.
For Kim Jong-un, now too, the war-like rhetoric is personal. In a statement, he said, "I will surely and definitely tame the mentally deranged U.S. dotard with fire." Add to this scenario Trump's refusal to certify the nuclear agreement with Iran and his further threat to pull out altogether. That prompted a direct response from Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, on Twitter. "I don't want to waste time on answering the rants and whoppers of the brute U.S. president," he said. On the program this week, we'll assess the rising tension and the fear of a nuclear attack. We'll also look at what's at stake for Canada. But we begin on the ground in Seoul, South Korea, where people fear they may be the first target. Se-Woong Koo is the co-founder and publisher of Korea Expose. Se-Woong, how would you describe the level of fear in South Korea?
If you were to just see the streets of Seoul today, you're not really going to sense much of fear at all. People are going about doing their business. What's different this time is this undercurrent of anxiety you're going to detect, and you're going to hear people talk about the fact that people are going to prepare backpacks filled with necessities so they can survive for 3 days, or talking about maybe having to buy a gas mask just in case there's an attack and you need to be able to breathe. These are kind of the things that you hear this time, which you haven't really been able to hear before when there were similar threats from North Korea.
You've written that you've talked about evacuation plans with your parents. What did you talk about?
Well, I mean, my parents are old. They're in their 70s. And maybe it's a bit of an overreaction from me, but I certainly don't want them to think about maybe being left behind. So I offered to go and pick them up, and my father laughed at me and said, "You must realize that roads are going to be blocked and cars will not be able to get through." I've also talked about trying to send them to a city far from Seoul, which would also be far from the demilitarized zone, which is the border with North Korea. And once again, they didn't think that was such a feasible plan. My spouse happens to be German, so I've also thought about having my parents leave the country with my spouse. But let's see. These are all plans that may not be realistic if there's actual conflict.
The deputy North Korean ambassador to the United Nations has said that the peninsula has been pushed to the brink of war. Is that the sense?
We have heard this kind of language from North Korea before, many times, in fact. So that itself is not surprising to people here in South Korea. What really changes the situation this time is that we see America engaging in very similar kind of rhetoric and also threatening a similar kind of response as what North Korea has offered to rain down on South Korea. And that's certainly what's alarming here.
How would you describe the reaction of the South Korean government? Where do they fit in this picture now?
So obviously, this is very difficult for the current government, which came into power back in May. This is a government that had offered during the campaign to try and improve relations with North Korea, which means reaching out to Pyongyang, offering more aid, and trying to bring about dialogue. But what has happened since then really is not conducive to dialogue at all. We see North Korea making threats and progress with its weapons program. And we also see America saying this is not something that they're going to stand by. But watching, so it's there's a sense that the government is essentially trapped in its foreign policy. It cannot really pursue the promise that it made in the campaign period, but it also cannot simply let America do what it wants. The government has insisted time and again that war is not something that is acceptable here. But then again, if you talk to the public, if you listen to, or rather read the survey results, you see more and more people becoming rather hawkish. They want the government to actually consider nuclearizing South Korea, to have a weapon that can counter the North Korean threat. And there are also people who think that things are getting pretty bad. So there needs to be something being done. But what can that be is the question nobody can really answer.
Se-Woong, thank you very much for your insight on this.
Thank you for having me.